In this video, we're going to be talking about the nitrogen cycle. If you don't already have your note sheet, please go ahead and take out your note sheet so you can complete your notes as we go along. So why should we care about the nitrogen cycle? Well, most of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen gas. 78%, in fact, is nitrogen. There is oxygen and some other gases mixed in that are important for life, but most of it's nitrogen. So humans need nitrogen, and all living organisms need nitrogen because it's part of our protein structure and part of our DNA. So we need it in all of our cells to make sure our body is functioning properly. Where do we get our nitrogen from? Even though most of the atmosphere is made of nitrogen, we can't actually use that form of nitrogen. We can't just inhale nitrogen as we breathe in and use that in our bodies. We must eat plants and animals to get nitrogen. Plants also cannot use nitrogen from the atmosphere. So in order for plants to get that atmospheric nitrogen, it first has to get fixed. So there's two different ways we can fix this nitrogen so that plants can use it. The first way is called biotic fixation. So biotic means living. For biotic fixation to happen, we must have some bacteria involved. So the bacteria is the living organism that's going to convert the atmospheric nitrogen into a form that plants can use. These bacteria live in soil, and they also live on the roots of legume plants. And legume plants, some examples are beans, peas, clover, alfalfa. So we have these bacteria living on the plants. All of the excess nitrogen that is fixed by the bacteria gets released into the soil. So the plant is able to use some of it, but if it's too much, which it most likely would be, it would get released into the soil around the legume plants. Here is just a picture of that happening. So we have a legume plant here, and we have all these little bacteria that are living in, they're called the root nodules. They're kind of just these little pockets in the roots. So these bacteria are going to take in the nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they're going to convert it into a form that the plants can now use. The other type of fixation is called abiotic fixation. Abiotic means non-living. So this is caused by lightning strikes. Lightning has a lot of energy. So when the lightning strikes occur in the atmosphere, some of the nitrogen in the atmosphere is going to combine with the oxygen in the atmosphere. And this makes nitrates. Nitrates are a form of nitrogen that plants can use. So all these nitrates are floating up in the atmosphere, and they dissolve in rain or surface water. So they're brought down to the surface, and now plants can use the nitrates. So nitrogen, it gets stored in the bodies of living organisms. But because it's a cycle, we need to make sure this nitrogen is going to get returned from our bodies and continue to cycle. So as organisms die and decay, decomposers are going to start to break down their bodies and their waste. And we're going to have denitrifying bacteria, which will transform some of the nitrogen back into the nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. So when denitrification happens, we're going to take nitrogen from living organisms and we're going to turn it back into the form that it is in the atmosphere. So it gets cycled back. So again, we've got a lot of nitrogen up here in the atmosphere. Most of the nitrogen actually is in the atmosphere. It can get out of the atmosphere in two ways. It can have abiotic fixation with the lightning strike and get turned into a form plants can use, or we can have the biotic fixation from the bacteria, and that will transform it into a form that plants can use. So now plants can take up that nitrogen either from either form of the fixation that happens. If the plants take it, there could be some bacteria that are going to convert it, denitrify it back up into the atmosphere. So we're going to see it continue to cycle around and around. How are humans impacting the nitrogen cycle? So we put nitrogen on our plants, just like we need, as humans, as we need nitrogen for our bodies to function, plants also need nitrogen to function. So when we put fertilizer, we're going to encourage our plants to grow faster and to grow stronger. So we put sometimes too much fertilizer on our plants. So when that happens, and rain would occur, some of that fertilizer is going to get washed off of the plants. That's called the runoff. So it's going to run off from the fields, and it could get into surface water, or it could get into groundwater. So now we've got excess nitrogen in the water. This could be dangerous for humans because too much nitrogen in drinking water can lead to cancer, and it can lead to respiratory distress in small children and infants. So that means it would make it hard for them to breathe. In the environment, this can impact ecosystems by causing eutrophication. So eutrophication is a process where first you have too many nutrients added to the water. So in this case, we have too much nitrogen added to the water. When you have a lot of nitrogen, you're going to have a lot of algae start to grow. Algae is a plant, so just like we'd put nitrogen on our crops to grow food, if that nitrogen gets in the water, the algae plants would start to grow. And when we have too much algae growing, it's called an algal bloom. It's just this big kind of clump of algae that's grown in the water. Eventually, the algae are going to die, just like all organisms die. And the bacteria that come to decompose the plants are going to use up a lot of oxygen in the water. So what happens is all of the oxygen gets used up, and then there's a lack of oxygen for the marine organisms that live there. So there might not be enough oxygen for the fish and for whatever other organisms are there. So here we can kind of see that process happening. You add your nitrogen to the water. We also add phosphorus, which is another part of fertilizer. And you have your algal bloom, so that big clump of algae starts to grow. They start to die and decay. And then the natural process of the decomposers breaking them down are going to suck up all of that oxygen. So now we have a lack of oxygen for all of the fish that are going to live in this ecosystem. So just to kind of recap the nitrogen cycle, some important parts to remember. We need bacteria to transform the nitrogen gas in the atmosphere into a usable form for plants. So we take nitrogen gas, which is N2, and it gets converted into either ammonia or nitrates. Plants are going to absorb the nitrates, and they can use them, make them into whatever parts of their cells they need, their DNA or protein. And then we as animals and other animals are going to eat the plants to get our nitrogen. The nitrogen is going to continue to cycle. When plants and animals die or excrete waste, the decomposers come along, which is another bacteria, and they release that nitrogen back up to the atmosphere. So it's going to continue to cycle around.